Good afternoon, everyone. As Megan said, we're here for our final session in our What the Hay series. And today we're going to be talking about matching forage quality with animal nutrition and how we can determine if our hay can meet our animals' nutritional needs. So to get us started, we know that forages, of course, affect our animals' nutrition. It's one of the biggest components of their diet, and it is an essential part of having them have good rates of gain, high production, good athletic ability, etc. So we know that forages do have an impact on the performance of our animals, and it will also affect their consumption, and then eventually, of course, our profit margins, and if we have any supplemental feed that might be required if we're not meeting those nutritional requirements. So we've talked a lot in the last few weeks about forage quality and all of the different factors that go into forage quality, the different components, how different things affect forage quality and make it better or worse. And this is just a reminder that forage quality varies a lot based on the different forage species and also different maturities. Lots of different factors come into play for forage quality. So when we're thinking about that and we're looking at the quality of our forage, we may look at something like a forage quality analysis and have a couple of different options and be wondering which forage would be best for which livestock species or for which animal. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So the first thing to consider are that in addition to forage quality varying, the nutritional needs of our livestock will also vary. So there are a whole bunch of factors that can affect the nutrient requirements of our different livestock species. Everything from the body weight or the size of that animal, the body condition score, or if that animal is a little bit underweight or overweight, the age of that animal, if it's a younger animal that's still growing versus an older or mature animal. The species can have a role. Of course, the level of production that that animal is undergoing, different environmental conditions, and then different activity levels. So we have a lot of different factors that can play a role in this. And we're going to go through a few of these factors and figure out, the different roles that they might play. When we're thinking about a livestock at maintenance, this is kind of always where we start from. This is a good starting point. So we know that the maintenance is the level of nutrition required to maintain a basic body function without weight loss or weight gain. So it's kind of a homeostasis, if you will. But there are a few factors that can affect the maintenance requirement of an animal. For example, one factor would be body size or body weight. So if we have, in the picture on the left, a miniature horse versus a draft horse on the right, we know that that draft horse is a lot bigger, has a lot more body weight and body size, and it will require a higher amount of nutrition to maintain that body weight. So the larger the body size or the more body weight, the higher the maintenance requirement of that animal will be. Maintenance can also be affected by things like the environment. So we know that in the wintertime when it's cold, livestock require a little bit extra nutrition to maintain their body condition compared to livestock that are, out in the amiable temperatures in the spring or summertime. So things like body size and environment play an important role. And actually, one of the biggest things that we can do for managing the environment is to feed that livestock some extra forage. It's a common misconception that if you want to, keep an animal warmer in the wintertime, you need to feed it some extra grain, but actually providing that animal with some extra forage, the fermentation from that forage will produce a lot of heat through that fermentation process and help keep that animal warmer. But we do need to provide a higher plane of nutrition when we have those environmental conditions that we're dealing with. So the next thing that can affect our nutrient requirements for our livestock is growth. We know that there's a certain level of nutrition required to add body mass or to gain weight. And this will depend on the amount of gain. So, for example, if we're expecting that animal to gain 1 pound per day versus 2 pounds per day, of course, the 2 pound per day animal is going to have a higher requirement than the 1 pound per day. This will also depend on the time of growth. And to explain a little bit what I mean by this, there are different times during the growth period when an animal is putting on more frame or kind of bone mass versus muscle versus fat. So if we look at this figure, we can see that as our body weight is increasing along our x-axis, we can see the changes in the amount of muscle, fat, or bone that is contributing to that increased body weight. So when we look early in the cycle, we see that the animals are gaining primarily muscle and bone mass for the first maybe 50% of that body weight gain. And as they get further along, they start to gain less muscle and less bone mass, and they switch to an increase in fat gain. Or, this might be thought of as something like marbling that might be occurring. And this is important because it requires different levels of nutrients to put on something like muscle, which takes a lot more protein, versus fat, which takes a little bit less protein and maybe some energy. So if we think about this in an example, here we have 3 different steers, steer number 1, 2, and 3. We can see that they have different body weights and also different average daily gain, or different rates of gain or weight accumulation, if you will. If we look first at steer 1 and steer 2, we see that they have the same weight, but that steer 1 is having a higher average daily gain. So 2.6 pounds per day versus 1.7 pounds per day for steer 2. So what does this mean in terms of their requirements? Well, if you look up kind of, an average requirement for these 2 animals, we'll see that steer 1 versus steer 2, of course, steer 1 will need higher energy requirement, or will have a higher energy requirement. He will also have a higher protein requirement because he's having that extra average daily gain that he needs to put on every day. And then there will be, some differences in some of our vitamins and minerals. He'll have a little bit higher calcium and phosphorus requirement as well. And this is all to support that extra gain that we're expecting from that animal. If we compare instead steer 1 with steer 3, we'll see that these 2 animals have a similar average daily gain, so they're gaining at the same rate, but steer 3 is further along in that growth process. He's up to 850 pounds versus 530 for steer 1. So what does this mean for their requirements? Well, even though they're gaining at the same rate, steer 3 has a higher body mass, and so he's needing a higher amount of energy to maintain that body mass and continue to grow. But you can see that the protein requirements are actually relatively similar between these 2 types of livestock. And this is because that steer 3 has switched away from the frame and the muscle building and towards the fat deposition part of his growth. So this is why, the protein requirements are somewhat similar, while the energy requirements are still a lot higher. And then the minerals between these 2 are relatively similar overall. The next stage of production that can also have an effect on nutrient requirements is reproduction. And this is because for 2 reasons. So first, the animals need an appropriate body condition or nutrient status to maximize their fertility or their conception at breeding. So if you look at the figure down below, they've done a lot of studies that have shown that cows and other livestock species that are too thin at the time of calving and rebreeding or breeding back, they will have a lower conception rate than cattle who have that body nutrient status that can support a pregnancy. So it's important, at those key times of life when we're thinking about breeding, lactation, which we'll get to in a minute, to have an appropriate nutrient status on that animal. And the other thing to think about from a reproduction or a gestation time point is that we do need to ensure that those pregnant cows or pregnant livestock have enough nutrition to support the developing fetus. So that brings us to the next production stage, which is lactation. And of course, we know that there is a high amount of energy required for milk production. This is true for all species. And this will depend on a few things. It will depend on the amount of milk that's either needed or produced. And one example of that would be, sheep that have different numbers of lambs. And for example, if a ewe has 3 lambs, she's going to need to produce a lot more milk to support those lambs than a sheep or a ewe that only has 1 lamb. So, the amount of energy required to support those different stages can be significant. The lactation requirements will also depend on the composition of the milk. So if an animal is producing a higher fat or a higher protein content or concentration in their milk, that will require additional energy above and beyond normal. And one thing to note about lactation is this is usually the most demanding period of an animal's life. This is when their energy requirements will usually be the highest. So here's an example just to kind of show you the ebb and flow as we go through kind of that lactation cycle. Along the bottom, we have our month of lactation, moving from early lactation to mid to late lactation and then drying off at the end. And we can see that as we move through lactation, the milk production changes. So it will increase up to a certain point, which is when we'll have our peak energy demand. And then it will start to decrease or taper off. So even within these different phases, we'll have different energy requirements or different nutrition requirements based on the stage of where they're at. So to do an example for, from a pregnancy and lactation standpoint, here again we have 3 different cows. The first one is pregnant and it is 1 month prepartum or 1 month before calving. The second 2 are both lactating. Cow 2 is 1 month after calving and cow 3 is 6 months after calving. And if we look at the nutrient requirements for these cows at their different stages, we'll see that between cow 1 and cow 2, the lactating animal, of course, has a higher energy requirement and a higher protein requirement compared to the cow who is pregnant but not quite lactating yet. That cow who's 1 month post-calving is kind of, entering or reaching her peak lactation period. So that's when her energy and protein demands will be the highest. And she also has higher, demands for other things like calcium and phosphorus. If we compare those to cow 3, who's 6 months after calving or, getting to be the time when we might be weaning that calf, her energy requirements will be lower than the one who still has a young calf at her side. So she'll need less energy, less protein, and less of those minerals because she's tapering down and, about to leave that lactation phase. Another thing to think about for when it comes to nutrient requirements is activity level. And this might be less applicable to, some of our production animals like cattle or sheep, but more applicable to those in the horse industry. So, a horse that's in light work, just doing some recreational riding or very occasional, light riding, won't have a high nutritional demand. As we work our way up the scale, we move into more of the flat work, lessons, kind of low level training. We might see more of a moderate nutritional demand from the horses in that stage. As we get into heavier work, maybe some jumping or low level eventing, those requirements will increase again. And then of course the classic example of kind of the highest performance horses, the race horses, the elite 3-day eventers, those kinds of horses will have a much higher nutritional need compared to your average backyard pony or leisurely trail horse. So if we put all of that together into one kind of combined slide, we can see that the livestock at these different stages will have a different requirement for, there are different nutrients, or in this case, it's presented as relative forage quality. So if we start, in the bottom left corner and kind of work our way over, the ones who will need the lowest forage quality are those dry cows, those idle horses, the ones who have a lower nutrient requirement. As we work our way up the scale, we might see a broodmare who's currently pregnant, a working horse who's kind of doing a moderate work level, and we can continue to work our way up through those different production stages. We can get all the way up to a young growing heifer, a stocker cattle that needs a lot of energy for gain, and then up to a dairy cow who's in her first 120 days of production, who is supporting that intense lactation period. So these different stages are really important to consider when we're thinking about planning out a ration or determining which forages are appropriate for our different livestock species. So I encourage you to think about what stage your animals might fall in and how that might affect their energy or their nutrient needs. So here's where I get to highlight again the importance of a forage analysis. I know I've said this in several of our past webinars, but it's really important to have a forage analysis because we can't tell the nutrient content of that forage, based on things like feel or texture or smell or appearance. We can really only evaluate this with a forage analysis. So if you haven't already been analyzing your forages or doing a forage test, I highly encourage you to do so we can kind of more accurately feed our livestock according to their requirements and know what nutrients we're giving them in that forage. Of course, this is a picture of what our forage analysis might look like. Here are all of, or a lot of the variables that are included in that. And we're not going to go through all of these today because we already did that a couple of weeks ago, but for anybody who might be either needing a refresher or who is joining us who missed one of our last recordings, I just wanted to go over a couple of the ones that we're going to be talking about for the rest of this presentation, just to kind of refresh our memories. So neutral detergent fiber is the cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin, which are the primary structural components of that forage. So they're located primarily in the plant cell wall, and they provide that plant with the structure and the rigidity and the integrity that those cells need to maintain that structure and grow upright and not topple over the taller that they get. And the important thing from an animal nutrition standpoint is that neutral detergent fiber is reflective of gut fill or animal intake. So as we increase our NDF concentration, we're increasing the fiber content of that forage, and this has a negative relationship with animal intake. So the higher the NDF, the lower the intake will be on that forage because those animals will be simply, too full. They won't be able to consume a lot more forage. The next one is total digestible nutrients, which is a measure of the energy value in a feed. And this is reflective of the available energy after digestion. So it's not really a direct measurement because it's a combination of a whole bunch of different nutrients that can all provide energy, including protein, fat, different fiber sources, and also the digestibility of those fiber sources, because we know that some of those fiber sources are more or less easily broken down, so they will be able to provide different levels of energy. So when you think total digestible nutrients, or TDN, think about available energy to the animal. And then finally, we have our crude protein. We know crude protein is an essential nutrient. Protein provides amino acids that are essential for normal body function. This one is also not directly measured, but is estimated based on the nitrogen content of our forages. So it will include both true protein sources as well as some non-protein nitrogen sources. So if we think about these three nutrients as kind of our key nutrients to start with, we have our fiber with our NDF or neutral detergent fiber. We have our energy through our TDN or total digestible nutrients. And then we have our protein from our crude protein. When we're thinking about rations, we want to have enough fiber to support a healthy GI tract. We know that ruminant animals and hindgut fermenters like horses require a certain amount of fiber in their diet to maintain that healthy gastrointestinal tract function. But we don't want it to be too fibrous that we're limiting intake because of that negative correlation with intake and NDF. For energy, we want it to contain enough energy to meet those animals' requirements. And for protein, we want it to contain enough protein, again, to meet those animals' requirements. So what's enough or not enough? What's high or low? Well, this will kind of depend on all of the things that we've talked about, the different stages of production, the different species, the different activity levels, etc. But to give you kind of a general range or an overview to use as a starting point, for a NDF level, I've broken this down into legumes and grasses because legumes usually contain a lower fiber concentration compared to grasses. So if you're looking at a legume hay, an NDF less than 40% would be a fairly low fiber source, and an NDF greater than 50% would be a fairly high fiber source. And if you're looking at grasses, an NDF less than 50% would be a relatively low fiber source, and an NDF greater than 60% would be a relatively high fiber source. So that just gives you kind of a starting point for fiber concentrations. For energy, again, this will depend on all of those different factors, but as a starting point, a TDN less than 55% will usually be a lower energy forage source, and a TDN greater than 65% will be a higher energy source. And for crude protein, a forage with less than 10% crude protein will be on the lower end as a protein source, and a forage with greater than 14% crude protein will be on the higher end as a protein source. So those are some ranges or starting points to keep in mind. When we think about matching these different forages to nutritional needs, we're going to go through some of those kind of categories or different livestock stages and discuss what type of forage might meet the nutritional needs within that stage. So we'll start with maintenance. An animal at maintenance will have a higher fiber requirement, a lower energy requirement, and a lower protein requirement. These animals aren't growing, they're not producing, they don't have a lot of activity, so they just need enough to kind of maintain their body weight and have enough nutrients to maintain what they already have. Examples of livestock that would fall into this category would be something like a mature bull or ram outside of the breeding season, a mature dry cow or ewe, or a mature horse that has minimal exercise. And for all of these types of animals, something that would fulfill these requirements would be something like a mature grass hay. Again, remember, a more mature grass hay will be one that you can see a lot more of the seed heads in that hay. It's probably a little bit more stemmy, a little bit less leafy of a hay. And this is a nice, good forage source for these animals that are just at the maintenance level. If we look into reproduction, we can kind of divide this into a couple of stages. We know that during the first and second trimester of gestation, animals will have a slightly lower requirement. There's not a lot of fetal growth occurring at that point. So they really don't need a whole lot more than what they may have needed at more of a maintenance level. So during those first stages of gestation, they might only need something that's high in fiber, low in energy and low in protein, similar to, the maintenance requirements. As we move into that, so this might be, again, something like a mature grass hay. As we move into that third trimester, this is where, those requirements start to ramp up a little bit. So we might want to drop the fiber down a little bit, provide more of a moderate fiber level, bump up the energy and the protein. So we have a moderate to high energy source and a more moderate protein concentration. So this could be something as, simple as bumping from a mature grass hay up to an immature grass hay. That change in maturity will increase the energy content and the protein content of that hay and decrease the overall fiber, and might be a good option for meeting the requirements of these animals as they're starting to ramp up in that late pregnancy stage. If we think about growth, again, this can be divided into some of those different stages. We already saw this figure, but when we're at less than 50% of mature weight, or when they're putting on a lot of that muscle and that frame or bone mass, that's when they need, a higher energy requirement, a higher protein requirement, and a little bit lower fiber. As they move from, above that 50% mature weight and into more of that fat accumulation phase, we might be able to, bump down to a more moderate fiber and moderate energy and a moderate protein source. And they won't need quite as much protein, since they have a lot less accumulation of muscle. If we think about that from, what sort of hay might be appropriate for those livestock species, when they're at that less than 50% mature weight and, having that muscle accumulation and need a little bit more, that might be something like an immature grass hay, or, it could even be something like a mixed grass, mixed legume hay that has a little bit of that higher energy and higher protein level. And then when we're simply looking at, that later, beyond 50% mature weight, they're probably okay with an immature grass hay, or, just a little bit slightly lower energy and protein source in their forage. When we think about finishing, this is kind of like that final growth stage where we're really, putting on the last amount of weight. And this is where animals will need kind of a very low fiber source and a really high energy to really pack on the pounds, and, a moderate protein level. So here's where we might consider some of those higher quality forages, an alfalfa or a legume hay, that high quality mixture or mixed grass legume hay. And one thing to note is a lot of times when we're thinking about finishing livestock, we don't usually finish livestock on hay. I'm not saying that, it can't be done, but usually when we think about finishing, a lot of times we need to provide a little bit of extra energy from some sort of grain. If we're doing a grass finishing, then that's usually done with pasture over hay. Usually, you time out the cycle appropriately so that you can finish them out by still having them on pasture, because that will be a little bit, higher quality than what we might be able to provide from a hay source. So if we switch gears a little bit into lactation, as we said, lactation is one of the highest demands on those livestock animals. So we want something that's going to be low in fiber and high in energy and high in protein, because we're going to really have to provide a lot of support and nutrients for that animal to support that lactation period, especially early on in that lactation cycle. So again, this would be when we would want something like a high quality legume or alfalfa hay, maybe a high quality mixed grass legume hay, when we really need that extra energy and protein. Again, a little bit like the finishing, this is another phase where we might need to keep an eye on the requirements for that animal, and we may end up needing to supplement with a little bit of extra energy. One of actually the common misconceptions for meeting animal requirements is that during these high demand periods, we need to maximize the protein. Actually, usually energy is the most limiting factor. This is true both for hay and on pasture. So we need to make sure that we have a high energy forage source and we're meeting those energy needs. And if not, you know, a little bit of supplementation or some extra energy might be required. If we think about the nutritional needs based on our different activity levels, again, we have our light activity, you know, our recreational kind of trail riding or leisure riding. Under this activity level, we kind of want something that's a more moderate fiber, and we don't need a lot of energy or protein usually for these animals to maintain and to perform. So, you know, a nice, good quality but mature grass hay will probably be sufficient for animals that have light activity. If we bump up into a more moderate activity level, that's where we want to have a moderate amount of fiber and maybe increase that energy and that protein level a little bit. So switch up, you know, upgrade a little to maybe an immature grass hay that has a little bit higher energy and protein. And then of course, with our really heavy activity, this is where again we'll want a low fiber concentration and a high energy and a high protein source. So something like an alfalfa, a really high quality legume or mixed grass legume hay would be best for those in heavy activity. One other thing that I did want to mention that's a little bit less applicable to some of our production species and more applicable to the equine community is some special cases. There seems to be a lot of special cases within the horse industry. And what I mean by special cases are things like obesity and some of the different metabolic issues that are becoming more prevalent in the horse industry. These can go hand in hand, or you know, they can be separate, but for both of these cases, we want something that's going to be high in fiber and low in energy and low in protein. You know, usually if horses have metabolic issues, not always, but usually they're also overweight. So we want to provide them, you know, with a low energy forage source and a lot of fiber to keep that, you know, healthy GI tract moving and have an appropriate amount of fiber in the diet, but not provide a lot of extra calories. So for both of these classes, something like a mature grass hay would be appropriate. Other things to consider are, you know, if you have a horse or any livestock who is obese, you might want to consider restricting their intake. So, you know, having a little bit less forage offered, even if they would eat more, they might not need it. And then the metabolic issues, of course, is where we run into concerns with the non-structural carbohydrate concentrations. And that's when it really becomes important to be careful with our forage testing and our ration balancing, is when we have to watch those non-structural carbohydrate levels. So those are just some special considerations to be thinking about. So here is where we get to kind of do a little bit of quiz time, I guess, or comparison time. And I'm wondering between these two feeds, which you would pick. So for this first example, we have a lactating beef cow who is 1 month post-calving. So she is has a calf at her side still, and our two forage options you can see down below, forage A and forage B. And I'm hoping, you know, you might just type into the chat box which of these you would prefer for this lactating beef cow. Okay, I see everyone saying B. That is the general consensus. And you, oops, sorry. So you would be right. So for this lactating beef cow, you know, she's entering that peak stage of production. We want a higher energy source for her. We want a lower fiber, and we want a higher crude protein level to support those needs as she's going through that lactation phase. Example 2, this is the only other example that I have, would be a pregnant heifer who is 4 months before calving. So she hasn't calved quite yet. And here are our two forage options for this heifer. If you had to pick, would you like forage A or B? I see we have a couple answers for A so far. other people might not be quite sure. So in this case, again, we want to look at, that energy, that fiber, and that crude protein level. And we see that the energy between these two forages is relatively similar. The fiber concentration is higher for forage A, and the crude protein concentration is lower for forage A. So forage A is a little bit more mature. And in this case, she is in that kind of mid-gestation period. She hasn't really ramped up to needing a lot of energy for lactation yet. So, something like a forage A would probably be sufficient to meet her needs. So the final step in kind of this process, once you've decided which forage is appropriate for which type of livestock or for which species, is of course to make evaluations and adjustments. We might have a plan A, a plan B, or even a plan C, and we need to periodically kind of reevaluate and make these adjustments as necessary to make sure that we're actually meeting those needs and we didn't draw any incorrect conclusions. So there's a few different factors that we can use to evaluate the status of our feeding decisions, and we're just going to talk briefly about a couple of those. The first is to evaluate based on body condition score. So we can think of body condition score kind of a little bit like a sliding scale, I guess. We have our optimum where they're maintaining a good condition level. They're in good health. They're not gaining or losing weight. They're kind of at that nice neutral platform. On the lower side, we can have an animal that has too low of a body condition score, which would be indicative of an undernourishment. So, if we see our animals start to lose some weight, to drop in that body condition score, we want to think about increasing either the total amount of feed that we're giving that animal or the nutrient concentration or, the quality of that forage, bumping that up a little bit to provide some extra nutrients in that way. And of course, the opposite would be true on the other end of the spectrum. If we have an animal with a high body condition score, that animal might be a little bit overnourished, in which case we want to either decrease the feed and or decrease the nutrient content or the forage quality that we're feeding for that animal. For anyone who is not super familiar with body condition scoring, they have a scale for all livestock species. Some of them are on a 1 to 9 scale, like cattle or horses. Some others are on a 1 to 5 scale. But regardless, it's really actually a good idea to familiarize yourself with the body condition scoring system for whatever livestock species that you have, so you can use that to make these adjustments as needed and kind of help guide you on whether those animals are receiving appropriate nutrition or not. So I encourage you to look up the body condition score for whatever species that you have and take a look at that and kind of try to learn a little bit more about body condition scoring. We can also evaluate our feeding decisions based on performance. And there's a lot of different factors that go into performance. One might be something like weight gain, average daily gain. If we have the opportunity to weigh those livestock on a regular or semi-regular basis and calculate their average daily gain or how much weight they're putting on, over the course between weighs, we can calculate our average daily gain and see if those animals are gaining, what we expected, or below or above what we might think that they should be gaining. For our non-production species who we maybe don't want to be gaining weight, we can also look at weight fluctuations. So if you have access to a livestock scale, that works great for monitoring horse body weight. If you don't, there are things that you can use like a weight tape or different measurements and calculations that you can use to kind of monitor their weight fluctuations over time. Performance can also include, of course, athletic ability. So, if our animals are performing their jobs up to, what we would expect, or if, they're lacking the energy or the nutrients that they need to complete those tasks, that can be something that we can use as an evaluation or an adjustment. We can also look at some different factors pertaining to reproduction. So, we can look at things like pregnancy rate, pregnancy loss, stillbirths. If we have an animal that has a really low pregnancy rate or a lot of pregnancy loss or stillbirths happening, is it because her nutrition is not able to support the demands of that pregnancy or that lactation? Or, is it something else that might be going on? So, keeping track of things like these, can be a little bit time consuming and a little bit tedious, but in the end, it will provide you with a lot of valuable information. We can do the same kind of thing with milk production. We can look at both the amount of milk produced and how that changes over time, as well as the growth rates of the offspring. If that animal has calves or lambs on her side, are those lambs or calves receiving enough milk to have a good growth rate from their mother? So those, again, are things that we can keep track of and monitor over time to see how an animal is doing, and then of course make according adjustments. And then we can also evaluate based on health. Sometimes if we see an increased incidence of certain diseases, that might be indicative of nutritional problems. There are really too many diseases to go through in this webinar. That's kind of a topic for another day, but keeping track of some health records for our animals can be a good way to evaluate their performance over time. And then we can also evaluate based on our feed intake. We kind of know on average how much we expect an animal to eat. We've established dry matter intake ranges for our different livestock species based on their body weight, and we kind of know on average how much we expect them to be eating. So if that intake is increasing or decreasing, we need to think about maybe what might be the causes behind that and do some evaluations of based on that. So to kind of wrap all of that up, when we're thinking about matching our quality with nutrition, it's important to know that the type and level of production varies between our different livestock species, and we need to determine what the nutritional needs of those species are. Consider all the different factors, weight, age, species, body condition, activity level, stage of production, etc., all play a role into what those animals will need. And then we need to select an appropriate forage to match those requirements. So a low quality forage if they have a lower nutrient demand, a high quality forage if they have a higher nutrient demand. And then finally, it's important to kind of evaluate and readjust as needed. So there are a number of different assessment measures that we can keep track of to kind of monitor how we're doing over time. And it's really important to kind of make those adjustments as needed. So with that, that was everything that I had for today. We'll pull up the chat box and we can see if we